Sometimes the most powerful moves of God begin not in palaces, but in kitchens, not with kings, but with widows gathering sticks. This is the story of a nameless woman in a forgotten town who gave her last meal to a stranger and ended up feeding a prophet, changing history and becoming a silent thread in heaven's great plan. If you've ever felt overlooked, exhausted, or at the end of your rope, this story is yours.
The widow of Zarephath, a hidden thread in heaven's tapestry. It was a time of drought. The skies had closed, and the earth had forgotten how to yield. The sun hovered each day like a merciless overseer, and the wind carried nothing but the dust of disappointment. In the dry town of Zarephath, near the edge of Sidon, lived a woman whose name history never wrote down. She was a widow. No one knew much about her, not even those who passed her door. She moved quietly, gathering sticks, baking small cakes of barley, tending to her son with a tenderness that only grief could teach. Her face was neither young nor old, just tired. Her hands bore the evidence of struggle, and her eyes, though dimmed, still held a kind of fragile strength. Her husband had died years earlier. He had been a fisherman, lost to the sea during a storm. Since then, each sunrise was a decision to keep going, to survive, and in the best day still believe. When the drought came, it stole the market first, then the neighbors, and finally the laughter. She had learned to live without abundance, but this was different. This was death on the doorstep. Her pantry was nearly empty. Her jar of flour sat in the corner, silent and nearly bare. Her jug of oil tilted at a lonely angle. That morning, as she stepped outside to gather a few sticks, just enough for one final fire, she repeated the words she had whispered 100 times. Words that felt more like habit than hope. God, if you still see me, help me. She didn't expect an answer. Prayers, after all, had become like echoes always returning, never arriving. But then came the stranger, a man, bearded, cloaked in dust, with a voice that was somehow both firm and gentle. He asked for water. She hesitated, but her heart, trained in mercy, obeyed. As she turned to go, he added something that froze her. Please, bring me a piece of bread. Bread? There wasn't enough even for her child. Her mind screamed, but something in her soul paused. She told him the truth. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. The man nodded slowly, then looked at her with eyes that seemed to understand centuries. Do not be afraid, he said. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She should have laughed. She should have closed the door. She should have said no. But she didn't. She obeyed. She gave the stranger the prophet a portion of her last meal. And something strange happened. The flour didn't run out. The oil didn't dry. Day after day, week after week, the same miracle repeated itself in her tiny home. Every time she reached for the jar, there was just enough. Not abundance, but sufficiency. Not a feast, but never famine. And in that quiet rhythm of daily provision, something in her began to heal. She did not know it then, but she had been written into something much larger. Her obedience wasn't just for survival, it was sacred participation. She had entered a lineage of hidden saints, those who say yes when nothing makes sense, who give what they cannot afford, and who touch eternity with their trembling hands. This woman's house became a sanctuary. It sheltered a prophet Elijah, the voice of God during Israel's darkest days. Through her, Elijah lived. And through Elijah, the fire of heaven would soon fall on Mount Carmel. False prophets would be silenced, and the people of Israel would remember who their God was. But none of that would have happened without her, yes. In a world that counted her out, God wrote her in. In a nation divided and drowning in idolatry, a foreign widow became a conduit of grace. In her barrenness, God planted a seed of abundance and not of wealth, but of eternal purpose. And then the day came when her son fell ill, so ill that he stopped breathing. Her heart, once mending, now shattered again. She turned on Elijah with the fury of grief. What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Elijah took the boy, carried him upstairs, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to God, not with polite words, but with raw, shaking urgency, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" He stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and pleaded, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And God heard. The boy breathed. The widow wept, and the miracle deepened. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she said, "and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." She had fed the prophet. Now the prophet, through God, had given her back her child. In every part of her story, a thread of grace had been weaving something much bigger than her pain. From the parched earth of Sidon, through a simple act of generosity, flowed a quiet revolution in heaven's plan. Her little home became part of the redemption arc. Her yes became a hinge in history. Her name remains unknown, but her legacy lives on in every believer who gives when it hurts, trusts when it's irrational, and obeys when it's inconvenient. She is proof that the stage of God's greatest acts is often set in obscurity, that the vessels he uses are cracked, humble, and available, that miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive in teaspoons of flour and drops of oil, and perhaps that's where you find yourself today, at the bottom of the jar, ready to give up, ready to say, "This is the end." But maybe, just maybe, it's not the end. Maybe it's the threshold of a miracle. Maybe your yes is the missing note in a much larger song. Maybe, like the widow of Zarephath, you're not forgotten. You're chosen. You're written in. You're a thread in heaven's tapestry. But the thread of heaven did not stop at the widow's doorstep. From the fire that kept the oil and flour flowing, grace continued to weave its way into the dry fields of Tekoa, where a seemingly forgotten shepherd would rise to become the thunderous voice of justice in a nation losing its soul. The shepherd of Tekoa, another thread in heaven's tapestry. Far from palaces and prophets, in the rocky hills of Tekoa, lived a man who didn't see greatness, but carried it in his bones. His name was Amos, a shepherd, a dresser of sycamore figs, just another face in the crowd. No one expected him to hear God's voice, least of all himself. Amos had rough hands, hands that pulled lambs from their mothers, mended broken fences, and bled under thorn branches. His days were filled with dust and dung, not scrolls and sermons. He knew the language of silence, the weight of watching storms, and the discipline of tending what could not speak back. But then, one night, the silence broke. It was not a storm, not thunder. It was a fire in the marrow, a whisper too loud to ignore. Words formed in his heart that he had never studied. Visions pierced his rest. He saw the northern kingdom Israelush with luxury, but rotting with injustice. He saw the poor trampled like soil, the righteous sold for sandals, and the altars stained with arrogance. And then he heard it. "Go, speak, prophesy." He could have refused. He was not a Levite. He had no lineage of priests. He had never been trained in the courts of kings. But something deeper than training called him, a burden he could not lay down. So Amos left the hills. He walked into cities where his sandals didn't belong. He stood in temples where his accent betrayed him. And he spoke. With clarity, with fire, with tears. He said, "You sing your songs, but God will not listen. You bring your offerings, but God wants justice to roll like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." The elite sneered. The priests scowled. One of them, Amaziah, told him to go back to Judah and prophesy there. "Earn your bread there," he said, dismissing Amos like a common street performer. But Amos answered not with pride, but with truth. "I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I was a shepherd, and I took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people, Israel.'" He didn't come for fame. He didn't come to build a ministry. He came because heaven moved. He spoke of plumb lines and baskets of ripe fruit images drawn from the simple world he knew, made sacred by revelation. He cried for the poor. He warned the proud. He shattered complacency with words born in obscurity. And though Israel didn't listen then, his words endured. They became part of the prophetic canon, a shepherd's voice echoing in eternity. Amos was not famous in his day. He likely died unknown, his grave unmarked. But heaven does not measure by monuments. It measures by obedience. Like the widow of Zarephath, Amos reminds us that God chooses unlikely vessels. That greatness is often cloaked in humility. That divine assignments come to those working faithfully in quiet fields. In the tapestry of redemption, the thread of a poor widow and a shepherd from Tekoa are woven side by side, proof that God's story is not only told through kings and warriors, but through those the world overlooks. Perhaps that's where you find yourself, not in the spotlight, not with pedigree or power, but with a listening heart. Then take heart. Your field may yet become a pulpit. Your yes may still shake kingdoms. Because God is still calling shepherds, and the tapestry is still being woven.